A narrow definition, which is typically the context in which the term is used, involves a deliberate attack using the internet with a social, political, or religious objective to intimidate or coerce a government or the public to generate fear or disrupt essential services. However, we'll take a broader view and try to assess cyber terrorism in the same way as terrorism generally, by looking at any type of terrorist and extremist-related activity using the internet. If we apply our working course definition of terrorism, then anything involving violent and nonviolent crimes by non-state actors, motivated at least in part by ideology, and committed by either individuals, small groups, or formal organizations, falls under the general umbrella of cyber terrorism as well. It will also be helpful to note the difference between cyber terrorism and cyber crime. How are they different? Well, cyber terrorism involves using the internet for a specific social, political, or religious objective. Cyber crime, in a general sense, could include any type of criminal activity on the internet. It is generally motivated by profit, fraud, theft, trafficking illicit goods, but could also be motivated by revenge or general destruction, such as with cyber vandalism, stalking, or bullying, or efforts to disrupt the intersection where the virtual electronic reality of the internet meets the physical world, such as hacking into and shutting down critical systems or networks as part of cyber attacks, which some have referred to as cyber war. There are intersections between cyber terrorism and different types of cyber crime, such as extremists using the internet for a wide array of criminal activity, but generally, like terrorism and crime, it's the social, political, or religious ideological motivation that separates cyber terrorism from cyber crime. Also, for the sake of simplicity, I'll be distinguishing between cyber terrorism in a general sense, which could include anything that falls under the broader scope of our working definition, and cyber terrorist attacks, ideologically motivated cyber attacks using the internet, typically to hack into and shut down critical systems. We went over some of these potential cyber terror threats when we talked about terrorism goals, tactics, and targets. I'll specifically refer to this as cyber terrorist attacks so the distinction is clear. Despite the potential threat from cyber terrorist attacks and the fact that cybercrime is flourishing, we have not seen successful cyber terrorist attacks in the U.S. Many calls for cyber terror attacks have been made by terrorist organizations for years, but any attempted attacks have been unsuccessful. This does not mean that it won't happen, just that it hasn't happened yet, that we're aware of anyway. While hacking attempts occur on a regular basis, they are not as likely to be carried out by terrorists, but rather by independent hackers and state actors. Hackers working on behalf of a national government, trying to access critical systems either for profit or to obtain critical information that can later be used to their advantage. This falls more under the category of espionage, and in the case of actions by national governments, cyber war and intelligence. On the other hand, concerns over cyber attacks in general, regardless of the motive, are certainly well-founded, and there is a tremendous potential for damage if attacks on these critical systems are successful. So this leads to an important consideration. Are cyber terrorist attacks less of a threat than we might think? This view is that concerns over cyber terrorist attacks, while not unfounded, are largely exaggerated, that infrastructure systems are more resilient than we give them credit for, and getting to them via the internet is very unlikely. For instance, it's impossible to remotely hijack planes. Instead, a greater potential threat is posed by insiders, such as employees of utility plants with technical know-how and access to facilities, may be more of a concern than remote hacks. In addition to potential threats from insiders, simple human error is also a concern. Many servers in residences and businesses are poorly protected, passwords aren't very good or changed often enough, and systems and information could be accessed through these poorly secured internet servers or due to making a simple mistake, such as clicking on the wrong email. For example, the whole mess involving the leaked emails from the Democratic National Committee and the Hillary Clinton presidential campaign in 2016 started with someone clicking on the wrong link in a simple phishing email. This offers another case in point for the exaggeration argument. While there have been substantial efforts to disrupt electoral campaigns by stealing and sharing private communications and targeting voters with misinformation, there have not been any reported successful infiltrations of actual voting machines to change votes. So, perhaps the threat is exaggerated. Even if it were, though, this doesn't mean we shouldn't be prepared or take efforts to secure our critical systems from these potential attacks. With that, let's put the issue of cyber-terrorist attacks aside for now, because even if we concluded the threat of cyber-terrorist attacks were exaggerated, this still doesn't mean terrorist use of the internet more broadly isn't a major concern. There is no doubt that terrorism, extremism, and hate are absolutely flourishing online. So, let's take a broader look at why terrorists and extremists use the internet in the first place. To start, the internet is easy to use, widely accessible, and cheap. Anyone can access the internet with relative ease and minimal cost. There is no need for extensive resources, personnel, infrastructure, or even planning to conduct basic operations or even a cyber attack online. It is also largely unregulated. There isn't much oversight on the internet, and with so much traffic coming and going from everywhere in the world, it's easy to remain anonymous. It plays a major role in spreading and sustaining extreme beliefs. Terrorists can use the internet to access and cultivate a broader base of support. Sympathizers to a terrorist cause are far more likely to act in the cyber world in ways they never would in the physical world. This could include engaging in cyber attacks, even if only minor ones on a very small scale, but could also include expressing extreme views that they would be far less likely to share in person. So how do terrorists use the internet? Well, they use it for many purposes. They use it for building their own websites, to take credit for attacks, for recruitment and networking, for spreading propaganda and fear, for sharing information, fundraising, identifying potential targets, and for coordinating attacks. Much of this activity occurs on the dark web, a hidden part of the internet not accessible through traditional search engines. The dark web is the deepest part of the deep web, the deep web making up the vast majority of information that is actually available online. The dark web is where a lot of information is intentionally hidden due to its illegal nature, such as child pornography and marketplaces for illicit goods. It is where communications can be most difficult to track, carefully masked with coded language, and often encrypted. This allows terrorists to securely share a wide array of information, including tactics, strategies, and plans for specific attacks. There has also been growing concern about virtual currencies, such as Bitcoin, being used for these purposes. But hate and extremism is certainly not just relegated to the dark web. Much of it is right out in the open. Countless extremist websites and forums serve as safe havens for the cultivation of extremist views. Here, those who are entrenched in their ideology intermingle with those just dabbling in it. Like-minded individuals can share their ideology and ideas without the social counterforces that can provide a check on them when shared in face-to-face social interactions. And there are cases of those who shared extreme views on these forums engaging in real-world acts of violence. For example, the Southern Poverty Law Center found over 100 people were killed between 2009 and 2014 by individuals who were actively engaged on Stormfront, one of the first and longest-running white supremacist forums dating all the way back to 1990. And that leads us to social media. The use of social media, particularly for disseminating and consuming extremist content, recruitment, and networking and communications, has risen dramatically. Social media provides a number of advantages for extremists. One is its wide reach. Social media usage among U.S. adults has dramatically increased over the last decade and a half. Though users have traditionally been younger, this is definitely changing, as more and more older adults are using social media. So extremists can really maximize the range of their influence through social media. And adults spend a great deal of time on social media. The most common social media platforms are Facebook and YouTube, used by around 7 in 10 U.S. adults. The next is Instagram at around 4 in 10, while others are less than 3 in 10. This tracks very closely with social media usage by extremist criminals. Social media platforms also provide the ability to use algorithms and bots to customize posts and messages based on the behavior of their intended recipient that indicates their preferences. In this way, terrorists can target their message and even create fake accounts pretending to be someone that shares similar values, views, and interests as the recipient. This is especially important because we tend to respond better when someone we know, like, or appears to share our general values and interests endorses an idea or shares information. Social media personas can give the perception of an actual social relationship. For many, social media becomes a substitute for a social life in the physical world. This is known as parasocial interaction. Terrorists can use this to their advantage by targeting vulnerable, impressionable persons who may be easier to win over to their cause. ISIL, in particular, is one of the pioneers of social media recruitment. There have been dozens of cases where individuals had no prior connection with terrorists but still fell victim to their propaganda and grooming. They typically target younger individuals who are searching for identity, direction, purpose, and acceptance, and slowly win them over to their way of thinking with grandiose promises of adventure, love, and fulfillment. Many of those who were radicalized in this way have been charged with material support for terrorism for traveling or attempting to travel overseas to join ISIL or another terrorist group. Social media usage certainly is not limited to jihadists. Far-right extremists have an even more extensive social media presence with, for example, substantially higher numbers of Twitter followers. Far-rightists have really mastered the art of message saturation, tweeting or retweeting hashtags and slogans hundreds of times per day to potential sympathizers. It also gives a distorted impression that these views are more prominent than they are, increasing their reach by triggering the algorithms that suggest them to a broader base of users. By doing this, they can aim to control the narrative and influence how often individuals who are targeted with these messages will think about the ideas presented in their propaganda. And this social media activity has been linked to real-world violence as well. The most notable recent example being the U.S. Capitol insurrection, which was facilitated by a tremendous amount of social media activity before, during, and after the attack. And there is some evidence that social media is shortening the amount of time it takes for someone to become radicalized. Seen here is the radicalization duration of individuals who were charged criminally with leaving or attempting to leave the U.S. to join a foreign terrorist organization. And we see the average length of radicalization trending downward over time. This lends credence to the idea that social media serves as an accelerating force in radicalization by cultivating extremist beliefs and solidifying a commitment to those beliefs. Still, there is much we don't know about online radicalization. One question is whether consuming extremist content online is sufficient by itself to radicalize someone, and then further entice that person to act on those newfound beliefs. Does the person already need to be predisposed toward accepting these extremist beliefs? Is there a catalyst event that drives the person toward accepting terrorist propaganda, such as some type of personal victimization? Does the individual need to develop some type of tangible connection with someone in an extremist movement? Or is simply viewing the material online without making contact sufficient for radicalization? So it's kind of the chicken and the egg problem. Which comes first? Do individuals become radicalized entirely online with no other influences, or do they start to become radicalized first, then seek out extremist content online to solidify those beliefs? Another critical challenge is how we go about identifying the individuals who may cross the line from belief to behavior, from promoting ideas to actively providing support for terrorists, engaging in criminal activity, or committing acts of violence. Only a small portion of those who post on extremist forums and share or consume extremist content on social media will take any of these actions. How can these individuals be picked out from the broader population? This certainly isn't a very simple or straightforward task. And finally, in what ways can the internet be used to reduce terrorism? Some have suggested that the internet actually reduces the chances of terrorism because it allows for expressions of social and political grievances without resorting to violence, and that we could use the internet to spread counter-narratives to those that spur on radicalization. This idea is central to programs aimed at countering or preventing violent extremism. These approaches are important and have shown some promise, but come with their own set of challenges, not the least of which is how these messages could be delivered to their intended recipients without seeming as though it is merely government propaganda, much in the same vein as extremist propaganda. This is especially problematic when trying to reach individuals who have a high degree of distrust in the government. There is also the fact that these efforts have primarily been used to counter jihadist extremism at the exclusion of other types of extremism. There is the inherent risk of targeting a broader group, such as Muslims or Arabs, based on these common characteristics with a small minority who are engaged in terrorist activity. Needless to say, it could certainly backfire and have unintended consequences.